Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Leaf and Mr. Aniket Bhagwat, for putting together these informative and introspective set of sessions for mapping the trajectory of landscape architecture in India. We are glad to be a part of this. Today, we'll be talking about how walks have enriched our practice.
Walking with the landscape. Walks are one of the ways with which we engage with a site or a place. It's something that a lot of people also do. We find it very invigorating, and we always pick up stuff like stones and soils, twigs and leaves when we walk, apart from an individual's impression about these places. When we come back to the office and exchange notes, we find that there are often contradictory and biased views about the same things, different views that we then figure out how to weave into the work that we are about to embark on. Our walks are often enriched by people who know these places better. They are very generous with their knowledge. They help us understand what we ought to factor in when we are dealing with these places. Maps, sketches, conversations, and texts help record and recall these perceptions and ideas. But the memory of the walk tends to transcend projects with questions like how can we make or heighten a memory or trigger recall for someone else? How can we suppress emphasis or do it lightly? We think that if we work at our design interventions this way, perhaps what emerges may mean something more to someone else. Like this instance, where a chance remark about bringing a nearby hill into the site became a connecting thread to the site planning. The older memory of the land is today supplanted with this new memory of the hill always being at a hand's reach. A sacred hill that we encountered in another site visit triggered ideas of what could be done at that point regards to the view. Keeping it as serendipity involved designing the ground for getting people till the point where the view opened up. But the point itself was left unmarked. An occasional trimming of the exotic silver oak trees is the only imposition that is seen. Looking for indoor-outdoor connects while loitering under dappled shade on site gave us an epiphany for fixing this site's issues. Often, fixing site issues is the only role landscape architects play when called in very late. Here, it required us to weave the highly erosive and acidic soils and create an immediate setting for the buildings to make them appear that they are touching the ground lightly. The intervention needed to be about the understory for whom it is designed. A multi-layered strategy is hidden in the outcome. It brings in a sense of refuge and privacy, accessibility, regeneration, pollination, propagation of coffee plants, and placing set pieces already collected by the client as an occasional eye catcher or a site utility. The monochrome palette helps in creating an experience that is somehow more than the sum of its parts. A meticulous planting plan was a guide to instinctive planting, a bit of which was also done by the entire office with the help of coffee estate laborers. Elsewhere, a setting demands the intervention to genuflect to it. This walk down a cliffside in the Konkan is visible only when a walker turns back to look at it. The allure of a pristine beach, replete with a lagoon, dunes, to which this walkway leads, is the obvious tour de force of the site. There is no meticulousness here, just occasional filling of gaps and grades to create a sense of flux while moving along the slope. Sometimes a walk on a site gives us the courage to erase a feature, especially a jarring one like this road between the Bahmani tombs at Ashtur. In its place, a proposed walkway suggests a halt or a pause in front of each building. Rather than girdling buildings or even taking them to the doorway, the pathway allows the user to hop on, hop off and explore these magnificent buildings in their own way. In another instance, a small geometric intervention is seen to influence entire mobility patterns lending better appreciation of a setting and the existing work of art that actually heightens it. Walking is also an intrusion. It oversteps boundaries and invisible bubbles. This is perhaps why birds fly away from humans when we approach them. Does nature demand a distance? And is that a function of a larger pattern or a continuum? For us, one way of understanding such a continuum has been about walking with satellite images to see if it suggests relational linkages tied to a site. It then prompts the reading of the site within a larger natural context and how they both can kind of, dialogue with each other. These continuums can also be a strong but invisible cultural cord, like the one connecting the Udaygiri caves on the top left and Shishupalgarh at the right. Such discoveries may not deeply influence the modern day site of the handicraft museum that falls on it. But it has certainly aided us in nipping the demand for experiential variety and exuberant design of open spaces, given that it's a public project. The preparation for this project was also a walk of sorts for us, a walk to develop a design tempo. Such trips introduce layers of life, culture, and form that lie outside the ambit of available information or scholarship. It's definitely not available online. They teach us about the erasure of everyday landscapes, be it at the scale of a village or the threshold of a dwelling. They point to the warp and weave, for example, between craft and nature, or the way plants are intrinsic to some aspects of livelihood and living. They also introduce notions about the transformative character of space. People, it appears, seem to use outdoor spaces rather differently than what we imagine them to be. At times, they even transcend the intent of the design. While study trips introduce us to ways of seeing, they also invoke dilemmas about trying to capture a sense of place for today's sensibilities. Now, it prompts questions like whether artifacts will work in a transposed setting, such as this forecourt of the museum. Does this space stand the danger of becoming a set piece or a whimsy, when the intent was about making it a receptacle for the forgotten? It is perhaps at this pivot that curation and narration, like the work done by the people who conduct guided tours of this place, prove to be useful to the cause. We were introduced to a rather meticulous way of walking by archaeologists, which allows them different perceptions of ground and place. An archaeologist, Ghulam Yazdani, while walking around Bidar in 1910, had commented on the few mango and tamarind trees at the tombs of the Barid Shah Sultans Ali and Ibrahim Barid, and the dargahs of prominent Sufis around. Yazdani had also pointed to a probable polo ground, likely to be of Bahmani period, the preceding century, which if true would have rivaled the Maidan-e-Shah at Isfahan, which is largely regarded as one of the greatest public spaces ever made. To understand the fabric in which the Barid tombs sat, we walked on the remnants of an old trade route, using the Barid Shah tombs as navigation markers and an old Survey of India topo sheet. Along the way, we encountered dargahs and orchards that indicated the truth in Yazdani's observations, even after more than 100 years. For us, the mango and tamarind trees put in perspective the outsized and never replicated proportions of the Ali and Ibrahim Barid tombs. This was a series of walks over a period of 2 years. It allowed us to partially reconstruct what we call a Bahmani suburb of Bidar, punctuated with a trade route, idyllic ponds, an Eidgah, orchards, a market ground that was mentioned in a travelogue. Later, in the 16th century, the tombs of the subsequent dynasty, the Barid Shahs, came along with the dargahs of Sufis they venerated, and all of this punctuated this area. This brought us to a realization of what is possibly a Sultanate era urban pattern in the Deccan between the 15th and 16th century, a peri-urban kind of a fabric, which was also replicated in places like Bijapur later on, or in Gulbarga and Firozabad prior to this. So in a sense, it's a continuum again. We created a cross-reference chart of water systems, famines, types of architectural spaces to arrive at an environmental history of the place. This is a part of a larger in-house study on the Deccan now. Armed with this understanding, we walked the immediate area around the Ali and Ibrahim Barid tombs with the aid of satellite maps and topographic surveys. We were looking for clues to water structures like wells, canals, organizational or regulating systems, outlines of garden, curbs, and so forth. Much of this edge today is fragmented or altered or completely lost. For example, the supposed goalposts, what Yazdani called the run khams, were destroyed as late as 2001. We were perhaps a decade late in getting there. Gradually, old extents of the buried tombs revealed themselves and new ways of entering and experiencing them became necessary. A landscape master plan now provides a framework for 3 broad zones of experience, keeping cultural realities and situations on the ground in mind. The mere act of visualization of these premises has taken us more than 3 years, involving discussions with historians, conservation architects, archaeologists, and going again and again to the site. A limited set of interventions keeping the site's needs in mind await implementation in the days to come. Walking can also tell us interesting paradoxes about landscapes, like this human-made underground freshwater system on the lateritic plateau of Bidar. Known as a Karez system, these borrow from their Persian archetype, the Kanat, with a principal difference. While Kanat taps streams and subsurface flows, the Karez at Bidar channelizes Bidar's copious rainfall on the plateau to an agricultural plain below the Bidar plateau. So it reverses the natural flow of percolated water against the topography. And as a result, its depth varies from 1 to 20 meters below the surface. And in a sense, it transfers water from one watershed to another watershed. The surface and subsurface expressions have no correlation other than the vents of the Karez, which punctuate the landscape at nearly 50-meter intervals for approximately 2 kilometers. The largest one at Nobad, which is 2 kilometers long, has a watershed of 1600 acres, most of which has urbanized, pushing almost 300% runoff and pollutants into it. As a result, it has scored badly at places and collapsed in a few. Figuratively speaking, it's a great opportunity to walk on water. The Karez alignment has the potential to structure urban form and land use. The conservation of what lies beneath is inextricably tied with what is remediated above. Therefore, its conservation requires a combination of amelioration and surgical approaches across scales, involving land use, governance, pollution management, designation as a special area, and opportunities for placemaking. Because so much of it is underground, such correlations are tough to understand, and it's even harder to explain why a multidisciplinary landscape restoration tactic is perhaps the best way to do this. The local community, which kick-started the desiltation of the Karez alongside the preparation of the structure plan, is the project's greatest resource and its greatest beneficiary. Can deep readings of historic cities point to the way we ought to think about land and landscape? They seem to hold a key to sustainable futures because they understand the intrinsic landscape character and they have harnessed it successfully for a long time. This method can be done even today through preparations like maps. Maps done with a focus on natural systems can pinpoint where the land wants to be left alone. But it is important that these maps also have a follow through in the master planning and the construction, else the land tends to give it back really hard. Mapping land for understanding intrinsic factors can be very illustrative. It can tell us magical things like where water is likely to be available, or why that rock peels like an onion, or why a lone tree is both good news and sad news. We find landscapes teach us constantly through the prisms of place, space, and time. Landscape architecture is both a funnel and a weave of those teachings. Thank you.